Everybody, welcome to 312, the HRP podcast. I'm your host, Tom Simmons, joined today by Bryan Massa, our Massachusetts regional manager, as well as the latest addition to HRP's incredible lineup of PFAS experts. Folks, we have an all-star roster of PFAS folks here, and Bryan is the latest MVP to join the team. We're going to be talking to him today about his background and about what he's going to be doing at HRP. First, I want to let you know, if you're out there listening, that you can see the entire episode this week on our YouTube channel. We usually split it up to be part audio, part video, but we're going to do the whole thing on video, combine the work hard and the play hard segments. So, Bryan, can you tell us who you are at HRP?
Sure. So I'm a principal and I'm a regional office manager for the new Massachusetts office. It's located in Plymouth, Massachusetts, which is where I currently live.
And what's your background before you kind of came to HRP? How did you get up into the industry? How many years have you been here? What's your experience in Massachusetts?
Sure. So I've been doing environmental consulting for just about 24 years now. I've done work all over the United States. I've always worked out of a Massachusetts office, but have done regional work. I started off doing environmental chemistry work at Battelle Memorial Institute in Duxbury. And then I got into your typical environmental consulting, doing site assessments, remediation projects, environmental due diligence, doing that all over the country, and then transitioned more into large-scale remediation projects and environmental forensics, manufactured gas plant remediation, attorney work for litigation purposes for forensics, and then have transitioned into PFAS site assessment, PFAS remediation, and PFAS forensics for probably the last 6 years or so.
Mm-hmm. In addition to do the PFAS forensics, which we're going to talk about more in a minute, I did want to hit on being an LSP. Can you tell us what that means for folks who are outside of the Massachusetts?
So in Massachusetts, we have a privatized system. LSP means that you're a licensed site professional, meaning that I've met the state requirements to render opinions on hazardous waste sites. So in Massachusetts, if there's a release, the work gets done under the direction, the investigation and the remediation gets done under the direction of an LSP, where the state has vetted us. We've passed the test. We have a certain amount of experience, 8 years of experience doing similar type work of site assessment and remediation, and then that we've passed a test and have the qualifications to do that type of work. So all investigation work and remediation work that's reportable to the state, to the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, gets done under a licensed site professional, under the direction of a licensed site professional.
So let's talk about PFAS forensics, because even as like a lay person, a non-scientist, I find this fascinating. Can you tell us kind of basically what PFAS forensics is?
Sure. So I've been doing forensics work for almost all of my career. When I was at Battelle, we were doing environmental forensics for petroleum hydrocarbons. So it's been used for a long time. And what it is it's a way to look at analytical data to distinguish sources, to make determinations on what makes them different. So for petroleum, people were using fingerprinting to, determine if there was a gas station release and you had two gas stations on the corner, whose petroleum was it? Figuring out age dating on it. Well, this petroleum is from 20 years ago. That gas station wasn't there 20 years ago. So using those type of things, and it's changed over time. People do it for PCBs. They do PCB conjugate analysis, dioxin-furans, and now, PFAS is an emerging contaminant. It's relatively new, and you can use the same principles that you would do for other environmental forensic investigations with PFAS. And what makes that helpful is, again, when you have a commingled plume where you have PFAS that may have come from two separate sites and they converge down at one location, how do you differentiate who is responsible for that plume? And then that goes further into cost allocation. If someone is responsible for impacting a drinking water supply, or someone is 80% responsible, another person is 20%. That's kind of where the forensics comes into play.
Yeah. And for those of you who are subscribed to the PFAS Pulse podcast that we do, you'll know that we recently put up a link to a talk that Bryan gave talking about the kind of forensics that he did on a site on the Cape. Can you tell us about that project?
Sure. About 2015 or 2016, one of the sites that I'm working on, that I'm the licensed site professional of record on it, It's a PFAS site. It's a location where firefighting foams were used. It's also a location that's hydraulically upgraded into a drinking water supply. In 2015, they determined that there was PFAS impacts in the municipal drinking water supply. And I think the first conclusion was that the airport was the responsible party for impacting this particular drinking water supply well. To give you a background on the area, there's a fire training academy that's also located hydraulically upgrading into the supply wells, and they're located maybe a mile away or so. So environmental forensics was key in this investigation to determine who had impacted the drinking water supply wells. Was this something where both the airport and the fire training academy had impacted the wells, where it was a commingled plume? Was this solely the airport's plume? Was it solely the fire training academy's plume? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where the environmental forensics came into play. And it's, there's a lot of different aspects to it. So it's not just looking at the chemical data, it's developing a really strong conceptual site model where, you look at multiple lines of evidence with chemical signatures being one of many. But we looked at purchase records for what the firefighting foams were. We tested the firefighting foam. We tested the source areas. We did all of this modeling, and we kind of were able to differentiate signatures where, the airport had used a certain type of foam. It had a certain type of chemical signature that was substantially different from the other type of foam used by the fire training academy. And it was different than what was seen down at the drinking water supply wells. So we were able to kind of put all these pieces together through investigation to identify that there was multiple sources that were impacting this well. It wasn't just one.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see those chemical signatures, to see that that these specific incidents have a shape, almost like they have a body that like you can see appear in these different places, and you're like, yes, that's that PFAS coming in here. It's so interesting to think that it has a specific identity to it.
It does. It generates a fingerprint, and you can look at the data kind of holistically. You need to have a real understanding of what's going on at the site, what's coming onto the property, because PFAS is ubiquitous in our environment. It was in all sorts of products that we used. It's located, throughout, not necessarily relating to a release, but it's something that we use in our consumer products. It's in our wastewater. It's in landfill leachate. So there's all these other sources of PFAS that can be impacting groundwater at a property. So it's very important to know, what's coming onto your property. What's the background concentration like? What is the change as it leaves your property? Is it the same, or is there now a different signature, which means you are adding something to the plume? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of all the things that, we had looked at over the years. I think that the forensics investigation work really came to play in probably 2020 when we realized that there was a widespread PFAS problem here. This was not just from this one source. We found PFAS coming onto the airport from properties located hydraulically upgrading into the airport. There was the fire training academy. There's a wastewater plant. All of these things all discharge to the same spot, to these drinking water supply wells. So the only way that you could actually differentiate this was by using environmental forensics. And this has been something I'd used in my career, going back to, the early 2000s. So I kind of went back and said, all right, well, I've used this similar type of approach for gas station releases and for other type of releases. So let's try it for PFAS. And it works for PFAS too. Mm-hmm.
So you could even think of the different potential sources of the PFAS as almost being like different suspects in the contamination. If you could fingerprint all of those different sources, you could match it to where your PFAS is coming from. Was that a way to think about it?
Exactly. Yeah. So what we had done for this particular site, we had a groundwater data set of probably 200 or so samples from different monitoring wells that were screened, upgrading to the airport so we could kind of see what's coming on. And we made forensic signatures for every single monitoring well location sample that we had so that you could kind of put those together and see where there were differences, where there was things that were commingled. So that's a great analogy. It's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Do you feel like a detective? Do you get like a trench coat and a fedora?
It is detective. You definitely are looking at more things than just, just these chemical signatures. The chemical signatures are a big part of it, but it's not the only part. It's just one of the things in developing a forensic conceptual site model. It's, it's the signatures, the fingerprints, and then it's the purchase records of foams and the history of foam usage and kind of all of these other things that kind of come in that, all together, put together this really good plan of what happened. Not just necessarily one thing that's, this is it. It's multiple things. So it's really, hard to disprove it.
Yeah. Can you even maybe even see the whole story of it unfolding when you have all the evidence together?
Absolutely. After, now I've been working on this site since 2018. So now, we've got all of the data. We've, figured out exactly what happened and have developed the conceptual site model. And you absolutely can figure out exactly what's happened. And we've presented that in various reports and, in various presentations that I've done that are all available online for the community to kind of discuss, this and kind of what has happened. But it does tell a story. Absolutely, it does.
Now, have you implemented or done forensics for other sites besides the Barnstable one then?
So we have implemented it on other PFAS sites. So we use this approach on all PFAS sites now. The one at the airport is a special case because there was a drinking water supply well that was impacted and there was a very large regional PFAS problem. But one of the things that we're moving forward with during our PFAS investigation is understanding that there's background levels of PFAS out there in the groundwater. And that, if you go to a particular site and you just test for PFAS and you find it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's from your site. So we've been tailoring our PFAS investigations to, look at what is the background level here. And, you may be adding to it, but you need to have some sort of forensics involved when you're doing these type of assessments, just because it's ubiquitous. If you don't, and you just jump into a PFAS investigation, chances are you'll find it, but that doesn't necessarily tell you if you're the source. It just tells you that there's PFAS on the property.
How hesitant would you say folks are to get involved with testing for PFAS, since we're still on the cutting edge of the regulations and the requirements, and how does that factor into the way that you kind of broach the subject with clients, or the way that you run into what they are required to do?
Sure. So different states have different regulatory requirements. So EPA hasn't made a determination yet on if PFAS is a hazardous substance or not. We expect it to be coming shortly in the next couple months. But a lot of states are kind of sitting waiting for EPA to make that determination to kind of finalize their regulations. Massachusetts, several years ago, went ahead and made their own regulatory requirements for PFAS. So there's regulations in place that if you have PFAS over a certain concentration, it's reportable to Mass DEP, and then investigations happen. So it's already highly regulated in Massachusetts, and we have, clear regulations moving forward. So we've already been doing investigation and remediation projects in Massachusetts now for several years. A lot of the clients that I talk to in other states are waiting to see what happens, what the requirements are going to be. I understand that, but if you think that you may have a PFAS problem, I would think it's something that the regulators always look better on if you just move forward and start your investigation, then wait until someone tells you to. There's one particular client that I'm working with that decided to test for PFAS before regulatory agencies were going to require them to. We approached the regulatory agency and told them that we had detected it, which wasn't a surprise. The state regulators weren't surprised that it was detected either, but they were very happy that they were moving forward with this investigation without the state coming to them. So they're actually one of the first in the state that have done this. And the regulators had told us that this was coming down the pipe anyway, that, maybe in the next year they were going to get pushed into doing this type of sampling anyway. So at this point, as the consultant and the client, you're in control of the investigation and are in a much better situation. So I'm always for, getting out in front of it, doing what you need to do and moving forward if you know that you have a PFAS problem or suspect that you do.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the Massachusetts office. Why Plymouth?
Great question. So I've been doing a lot of work on the Cape for the last probably 5 or 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
I live in this area. I've been doing a lot of work in this area, so I think it just makes sense to stay in this area. I've built up a good consulting reputation in the area. Mm-hmm. There's obviously a lot of PFAS work going on the Cape. I have other projects that are PFAS sites that I'm the LSP of record as well that are also PFAS sites on the Cape. So I think that it makes sense for it to be in this area. Mm-hmm. Plymouth it's a great town. It's close to Boston. It's close to the Cape. It's close to Rhode Island. So it's in a good strategic location as well.
Absolutely. What do you see in the future for the Massachusetts office? Because we're just getting it spun up there, getting ready to go. But where do you see it going in the next few years?
So I think that my thought for this office is to continue doing our PFAS forensic work, litigation support, remediation. LSP services has always been a product line. I'm an LSP, and Massachusetts has its own regulatory requirements for that. Environmental due diligence is also a big practice area for us. So I think that we're going to stick with doing traditional environmental work, but really start to build up the forensic PFAS aspect of our work, as well as utility-related work for manufactured gas plants.
We were talking earlier about work at airports and how there's a lot of PFAS-related work at pretty much most airports. Could you speak a little more about that?
Sure. So certificated airports, which are certified through the FAA, use firefighting foams that contain PFAS for emergency purposes. Firefighters would train with these types of foam. They would spray this type of foam out of their firefighting vehicles per FAA requirements to show that their apparatus worked. Mm-hmm. So historically, there's been requirements that fire apparatus get tested annually to spray foam to verify that they meet the 3% foam consistency, so that if there was an emergency, they know that their equipment would work. This, was done typically in, areas of the airport, just, kind of pull off to the side. We get sprayed to the ground, may get sprayed on the runway and then get washed out into the stormwater system. But ultimately, these PFAS impacts would find their way to the environment. They would also do triannual MCI, which are mass casualty incident training drills. So every 3 years, they would do a big mock exercise to train if, there was an aircraft accident, and that had happened, and they would spray foam for training purposes. Again, when they were doing these things, nobody knew that this was a bad thing. Mm-hmm. People were doing this as just, this is soap. This isn't something that we really need to be concerned about.
Yeah.
And, this went on, starting in the 1990s, even before that, but the requirements really came into play in the 1990s where this was something that would get done. And then another thing, the fire trucks would spray just what they thought to be water out of them, daily or several times a week, again, to show that the equipment had worked. But if there's faulty valves inside of the fire trucks, then you get foam leaking by the tanks into the system that can actually come out, not intentionally, but mm-hmm. could come out. And again, another way that it would get to the environment. So a lot of these airports have these locations where they would spray foam for FAA requirements, that they would do training for drills, or that they would just go and spray what they thought to be water every day in a particular location. Some airports maybe did it in one spot. Some airports maybe did it in multiple spots. But, it's definitely going to be a concern for areas that are in drinking water supply areas. And it's an especial concern down the Cape, because a lot of the drinking water supply is coming from both private and municipal wells, and there's a sand and gravel aquifer there. So contamination can become highly mobile and move pretty quick in the Cape.
When it comes to the firefighting foam that's used, do you see it being a pretty consistent product throughout, or are there many different firefighting foam products that have varying levels of PFAS in them? So is it like a consistent thing, or do you see a lot of variety in that across different airports?
It's very different. So there's different types of foam manufacturers that all would have their own proprietary mix for foam. There's also generational changes. So there's changes in the process that manufactured the foam and the types of foam that have been used. So, older generation foams, PFAS primarily. Now, a lot of the newer foams are fluoropolymer-based foams that are still bad, but they're not, primarily PFOA or PFAS. They're made from a different process. So there's various types of foam depending on the usage. There's mil-spec foams. There's foams that aren't. It just depends. Multiple different manufacturers of the foam. So you'd expect that there's different types of chemical signatures. And that's one of the things that made this very easy when we were doing the forensics, is that there was two clear different types of foam that were used. So two totally different types of signatures. You had the older generation foams, which were these PFOA, PFAS-based foams, where, large percentages, 70+%, all the way up to 90% are related to those analytes, where the fluoropolymer-based foams they have those contaminants in them, but at much lower, 5%, but 90% fluoropolymer, which you don't see in the other one. So you can clearly see distinctions in the chemistry, but it's very important to know what type of foams were used. So you can kind of say, well, yeah, that makes sense. So there definitely is variances in the type of foam and what the chemical signatures are.
Yeah. I think of PFAS, I think of nonstick surfaces, of water repellent materials. What is it about those particular chemicals that make them effective for firefighting foam?
So it's kind of the same thing. So these chemicals are the forever chemical is what everyone likes to call them. They're very hard to degrade in the environment. So they become a perfect substance to use in a fire. They're not going to break down. They're not going to degrade. They're hydrophobic, meaning that they want to float. So it's able to suffocate a fire. They also have great water repellent capabilities, which is why, they go into your Gore-Tex clothing, into your, Teflon pans, those type of things. So those properties are what makes them special, and their stability and the resistance to heat and temperature and water repellent properties is what makes them, so useful in our products. You get your anti-stick pans and food wrappers from fast food restaurants, because of their, anti-grease properties. So that's kind of why it's become so ubiquitous in our environments, because all of the different uses that are there.
And so, like you were saying, they were thinking it was a soap. So it's like a chemical substance that comes in, and does it then get mixed with water and sprayed out into a foam?
Yes. So it comes as a foam concentrate. And that foam concentrate has PFAS in it. It's almost like a soap matrix, and it gets mixed at 3%. The ratios change is also 6% foams, but 3% is kind of a standard mix. So it would be 3% of the foam mix with 97 parts water, and then that goes through a special type of nozzle with the fire apparatus and makes the foam.
So one of the other things we could talk about with PFAS that I think you've got some expertise on would be the sampling. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So PFAS sampling is kind of its own animal. It becomes very difficult to do PFAS sampling correctly because, again, it's in so many of our products. It's in our waterproof gear. It's in our Right in the Rain notebooks. It's in, our consumer products, our personal care products. It's in so many of the things that we use that if the sampling isn't done appropriately, it's very easy to cross-contaminate and to introduce PFAS into something that may not even have PFAS in it. So one of the things that's very important is, putting together a sampling program where samplers are aware of the requirements for testing. And those requirements, are, not wearing waterproof clothing, not using Right in the Rain notebooks, not using Sharpie markers, not using blue ice, and staying away from those products for several days before you go out and sample. When you do your sampling, you want to make sure that you're wearing appropriate clothing, cotton clothing that's you've had for a while, not brand new right out of the store. Not things that have recently had fabric softeners used on. There's kind of all of these different things that really need to be followed so that when you do your sampling, you're not introducing contaminants into it. One of the things that we try to do to control this is doing blank samples and field blank samples and equipment blanks. one of the worst things that could happen is if you're doing residential drinking water sampling to determine if a PFAS plume has impacted private drinking water wells, is to collect the samples in a way that you've possibly introduced PFAS contamination in them and get false positives where maybe you're going to put a point of entry treatment system into this residence for something that may not have even been there. So it's very important to take that into account and to have really good sampling protocols in place, collecting those blank samples and equipment blanks, checking where you're sampling. If you're sampling a drinking water well, is there, Teflon tape on the area that you're sampling? Did someone put tape around it because they didn't want drips to happen? That could potentially be a source of PFAS. It's not really in the water, but it's in part of the product. Collecting stuff in the appropriate bottles. Plastic HDPE bottles are used for PFAS, not using glass. So there's all of these different nuances that are really important that vary greatly from the traditional type of investigations that we would be doing for, chlorinated solvent plumes, for BTEX, for these different things where you don't have those clothing requirements. Writing in the RAID notebooks is a staple that I think every single field person has used for their entire career. And then all of a sudden you're going out and using loose leaf paper, and a pen, and not using a Sharpie marker, kind of those things that, you don't really think of. But when you start to look at how PFAS is in so many of our products, you start to see why we have such a wide scale problem and how come it's very difficult to do a PFAS investigation.
And when you're sampling, those procedures protect the sample from being contaminated, or are they also designed to protect the entire system that you're sampling from being contaminated by PFAS?
You want to take into account for both. So you want to make sure that you're not introducing PFAS contamination into your samples, but you also want to make sure you're not introducing PFAS contamination into yourself. So that's wearing your appropriate PPE that you can, like wearing your nitrile gloves, eye protection for splash hazards, for those type of things, so that you're not coming in contact with these products.
Do you foresee a lot of those sampling procedures lasting throughout the foreseeable future, or do you think that maybe some of them are the product of an overabundance of caution, and that as we learn more and develop better methodologies and better procedures, that some of these things might disappear?
Well, I know that initially there was a lot of labs that were participating in studies to test these products. So some research has been done to find products that are okay to use and products that aren't. So I know that the list may change in the future, and maybe as PFAS analytes are, dropped out of production and aren't being used and phased out, that maybe that list will change. But a lot of the initial work that was done by some great labs early on really helped to identify these problems for what we should stay away from. But I'm sure just like anything, as time goes on, the list may change, but I think it's going to be because of PFAS being removed from the manufacturing process. But for now, we're assuming that, these products that have PFAS in them that we'll stay away from. A lot of them are like personal care type products. There are some that have been cleared, like bug sprays, that are okay to use. Michigan has a great list of stuff that they've tested that talk about consumer products that are okay to use, suntan lotions, bug sprays that are acceptable, down to the brand. It needs to be this particular brand that's this particular type because that one was okay. So there's definitely been a lot of research that's been going on and documents out there, and the science is always changing. So again, I would caution that you really understand how you could affect your PFAS sampling if you were to go out and sample. That you're really careful with the consumer products and with these other things, because the regulatory limits are so small. Massachusetts, its drinking water is 20 parts per trillion, which is, like a grain or two of salt in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So if you're wearing, Gore-Tex clothing or something that has PFAS in it, and you get, a sample that maybe drips off and gets into your sampling equipment, or if you're wearing waterproof gear because it's raining out and you get that into your sample, you can bias your sample very easily and all of a sudden have numbers that exceed a regulatory standard that really aren't there. So again, it's, one of those things that, through a good sampling program and having really good qualified field staff that understand it, that you can avoid it.
So what is it that brought you to HRP?
So HRP is a well-respected environmental company, and I've actually had been working with HRP on some projects collaboratively over the last couple of years, and I think that it just made sense to help grow my environmental team, so to say, was to partner with HRP and to grow Massachusetts office with, the help of a really great team. HRP has some really talented staff that I've got to work with over the last couple of years. And, I think that continuing on that relationship is going to be, great moving forward.
Absolutely. So you've been enjoying it so far?
I have. Yeah. It's been great working with some great people.
Well, it's been great to have you. And
Thank
great
you.
to have you on this episode.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody out there, also thank you for joining us as well. This has been the 312 podcast. If you are still listening, please make sure to rate us 5 stars on whatever podcast platform you have. And if you're with us on YouTube, hey, thanks for joining us here. Make sure to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and thumbs up. And everyone, thank you again. Bryan, thanks.
Thank you.
We will be seeing you next time, folks. Bye.